Talks of David Solomon, podcasts on topics ranging from Jewish history and the Bible to Jewish mysticism, philosophy and thought. To find out about David's talks, books and more, visit davidsolomon.online. And now, here's the lecture.
I'm very excited. I feel almost like we should make a shehechianu, simply for those of you who are familiar with what that means. Oh, Simon. Every time you do something for the first time, there's a special benediction you should make that we have merited to this day. And the day that we're talking about, that special day is that, as you know, every once in a while, I'll dive into a century. And there's a few centuries I've done, but I've never done the 16th century. And so tonight we're going to start on this journey into the 16th century. And thanks to Rabbi Groner, who has allowed us for this opportunity to really tackle a subject that is beyond fascination. When I say beyond fascinating, because those of you who even have a moderate or tangential knowledge of the 16th century will know that we are talking about a time in the world that is a century that for drama and for things that are happening and for the world changing can only really be matched. I'm not even sure it is even matched by the 20th. The 16th is phenomenal. It's the birth of what we are going to call the modern world. However, as with all things, when you start looking at things in more and more detail, it's possible to get lost. It's just like you're swimming in an ocean, and the 16th century is an ocean. So the first challenge is to work out how we're going to sort it out over 4 parts. So tonight I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time, those of you familiar with the way I structure courses like this, is that I'm going to spend a reasonable amount of time backgrounding historically what's going in the world in the 16th century so that what we talk about afterwards can make sense in context. We have to put ourselves in that world and understand that world. It's impossible to understand Jewish history without understanding world history and its major currents, and the 16th century is one of those just massive yardsticks in human history. So we're going to do that. I'm going to spend that, and then we'll do a couple of talks on more specialist topics. We'll probably have to spend at least one talk focusing mostly on the spiritual revolution that happens, the whole Safavian project and so on, which is fascinating. We'll spend a talk on that. We also need to spend a talk talking about women, because the 16th century is the century of the Jewish woman in a way that no other time in history was. And those of you sitting there going, really? I've never heard that. You should know that there's a lot about women that we don't know. And there's a lot about women in Jewish history that we don't know, and we are uncovering that. The 16th century is mind-blowing and makes you realize that the generation we live in today is somewhat clueless in relation to the status and role and contributions of women throughout history. It's getting a little better, but the 16th century is amazing. We're going to spend a talk on that. And then I've left the last talk for basically anything that we need to fill in the gaps, and also it's inevitable that even tonight I'm not necessarily going to be able to talk about all the things we need to talk about. If, however, you follow me through those 4, all of which overlap, we will come out with something like a master's level education in the 16th century, and you will not be embarrassed at any of the fancy dinner parties you're sitting at where the subject of the 16th century comes up, as it so often does. I'm going to start with an idea really that I'm going to start with a story really that happened 15 years ago, towards the end, nearly 15 years ago, towards the end of 2002. And it happened to me, me and a few others. That was the year that my father, Oliver Shalom, passed away, and I had to go back to Perth. I was living in London at the time, and I flew back for the funeral and to sit Shiva in Perth. This was towards the end of 2002. And towards the end of that Shiva, it came to my attention, and as it came to a few other people's attention, a remarkable thing that had happened. Because the Jewish community had been contacted by a monastery, a Benedictine monastery in a place called New Norcia, which is about 200 kilometers north, not in any direction that you would normally think of. 200 kilometers northeast of Perth is New Norcia. It was founded in the 19th century. This monastery was built in a place that the Aboriginal peoples there had regarded as a place of bad spirits, and they'd built this monastery. Anyone heard of New Norcia? Anyone familiar with it? That's how obscure it is. We're talking about a monastery in Australia. And they contacted the Perth Jewish community because they had discovered, they had been going through some archival cupboards that hadn't been touched since the 40s and 50s, and they were clearing them out and stock taking them, whatever they do there in monasteries, in their libraries. And they had found a Hebrew manuscript, and they didn't know what it was. So they had taken a photograph of it and they had sent it to the rabbis, and the rabbis were a bit confused about what this is, and they asked around, and then it was brought to my attention while I was in Perth sitting shiva for my father, and within a few days I and three others, three rabbis and myself, were in a car going up to New Norcia to have a look at this manuscript. That itself is a fascinating story, and what happened with that manuscript, because the Vatican never gives anything back. But this was returned to the Jewish people, this manuscript. This manuscript is our portal, in a way. It's our time machine back to the 16th century and to the very beginnings of the 16th century and what the 16th century is dealing with. Because this manuscript was a very, very influential book. It is probably, the Shoshan Sodot is probably the most comprehensive book of Jewish practical sorcery that we have. When I say practical sorcery, people are looking at me going, really? I'm talking practical Kabbalah, formulas, ways of effecting the reality around you. I'm just turning off my phone because I heard it buzz. And it was written by a man called Rabbi Moshe ben Yaakov, of Kiev. And it was written at the very end of the 15th century. And the story of its composition is remarkable because he's living in the 1480s in Kiev. You can imagine what Kiev would be like at the end of the 15th century. It's a boch. But it's kind of the last outpost of possibly what could be called European civilization before it just becomes Banun. As the further, is it like you can't go more east than Kiev and still find yourself within anywhere range of a flush toilet. Although, even in the 16th century, anyway, he's living there. And of course, Kiev, being on that eastern front of civilization, is very vulnerable to raids, and we know that consistently right throughout the Middle Ages, the Mongols and their various combinations were constantly raiding the eastern borders of whatever was European civilization. And at one of those raids in 1480, they attacked Kiev, and they attacked the Jewish section of Kiev, and they took Rabbi Moshe's, this is before he wrote the book, they took Rabbi Moshe's children away. And he spent the next 10 years wandering, looking for his children. It's a phenomenal story. in the course of which, to every community that he went, he collected traditions from mystics, Jewish mystics and practical Kabbalists, and he compiled them after 10 years, and he found his children. He found his children in the Crimea, and then they took them back to Kiev, where he wrote up all of his journeys and his things in a massive book called Shoshan Sodot. It is a very early manuscript of Shoshan Sodot that ended up in the monastery of New Norcia. How that happened is a whole other story that we may have to look at another time. I'm going to stay with Rabbi Moshe of Kiev. I'm going to draw the famous map because we can't understand the 16th... People are laughing when I go the famous map. We can't understand the 16th century unless we can see this world. I need us to move into this world. That's the Mediterranean. There's Spain. This is North Africa, right? There's the land of Israel. And of course, Rabbi Moshe of Kiev is living somewhere, I don't know, here. In 1495, all of the Jews of Lithuania are expelled. Now that's a fairly regular occurrence to Jewish communities right through for the last few hundred years. That's not new. They were expelled. In fact, but it is remarkable in the context of Lithuania and Poland, because until that point, Poland especially, but also Lithuania, had been very benign places for Jews. They hadn't really experienced much of the classic models of anti-Semitism or even authoritarian rule over Jews that they had experienced over here and over here and over here. It was still relatively new, although it was about to take off, Jewish life in Poland and Lithuania. But in a last burst, at the end of the 15th century, the Jews of Lithuania were all expelled. And then 8 years later, the king who expelled them changed his mind and allowed Jews, the same Jews, to all come back. And if you could buy your property at the price that you sold it at, then do it. They all came back. Moshe ben Kiev was amongst those who had been chased out by the Tatars back in the early 1480s, had come back, been expelled by the king of Lithuania in 1495 with the rest of the community, and returned in 1503. Rabbi Moshe ben Yaakov of Kiev is an example in a microcosm of the kind of world and conditions that most Jews are living in. I'm now going to just talk about what we can talk about the 16th century in world history, and then I need to show you, just because what is actually happening in the world at this point is a game changer for the world that we live in now. Until this, more or less this time in history, certainly throughout Europe, but elsewhere in the world, geographic entities were ruled by small kingdoms or principalities or fiefdoms. What we're now seeing in this transition in history is the movement towards greater areas of control as these principalities and kingdoms merge, with greater control over larger expanses of area comes more stability. With more stability comes a different economic way of operating. So all of that is happening. We've already got France as a whole unit now. Germany is still more or less in principalities. Spain has now been unified for the last few decades, more or less. They're starting to call it something approximating Spain with the merger of Castile and Aragon. Italy is still more or less papal principalities in a kind of a reflection of what's going on in Germany. because this part of the world is called the Holy Roman Empire. And it's been the Holy Roman Empire since Charlemagne in the early 9th century. It has kind of two rulers, if we open the door on the year 1500. It has kind of two rulers. One is the Holy Roman Emperor, who's sitting in various places in Germany. And the other, of course, is the Pope, who is sitting in Rome. I haven't said anything of substance or in marvellous innovation yet. We're just laying the groundwork to understand. We're going to come back to the Holy Roman Empire in a moment, because I need to understand really what's just happened in Jewish history. Of course, there are no Jews in England. There have been no Jews in England since the 13th century, officially. So we don't really talk about any Jews in England at the opening of the 16th century. The entities that matter for us is the Holy Roman Empire. Just doing the map at the moment, that's all. This is the Ottoman Empire. This is the Ottoman Empire. And it's on the move. The Ottoman Empire, which is an Islamic empire based in Turkey, so it has all of Turkey, it has what is now Greece, it has quite a bit of the Balkans, and it's starting to expand eastward and southward as well. At the beginning of the century, it does not yet have Mecca. It does not yet have Jerusalem. It does not yet have Egypt. The Mamluks are still in charge in Egypt. But the Ottoman Empire is growing in strength and confidence and power. These are our basic divisions. Here we've got more or less small Arab entities. There is a constant tension, of course, now between Christian Spain and the Islamic North, but for the most part, this remains in Islamic hands, but not yet part of any greater empire. Over here is the kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. But what's just happened in the year 1500? Let's move away from Kiev, but let's just look at the world. What massive, enormous event. Okay, so I wasn't clear. People weren't sure. Are you talking Jewish history or are you talking world history? What's amazing?
Renaissance.
Okay, well, the Renaissance is happening. And we're in the High Renaissance in Italy. Yep.
The Inquisition.
So very good. So in terms of what we were just talking about, the Ottoman Empire, their big moment to this point, their big moment has been in the 1450s. They've actually taken Constantinople. They've conquered Byzantium. That's the end of the Byzantine Empire.
Protestants. The Inquisition.
Oh, not yet. We're in the year 1500. We're opening the 16th century. The Inquisition is very important. There are two things. The question wasn't fair because I wasn't specific. So let me say, what ginormous thing has just... No. Just wait for the question. Very good. We're going to deal with that, but wait for the question. What ginormous thing, if we're in 1500, has happened in the Jewish world? The expulsion from the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. I know that some of you said that first off because you understood the question, but we can't underestimate the impact of that if we begin to talk about Jewish history of the 16th, and we need to spend a few minutes. All of us have heard, the expulsion from Spain, right? And the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and that was like really bad. And that's what we learn, and then we move on. But once you start moving into the 16th century in a bit more detail, you start to realize just the enormous impact of that event. And they were, in fact, several events. We have the Alhambra Decree of 1492. What else happened? Two other things significant to Spain, and they are all linked two other things significant to Spain have happened in 1492. Columbus, and he set sail for...
Well, they thought it was a new world.
Yeah, he didn't know it was a new world. He thought he was going to the old world. Columbus went... Columbus was wandering around Portugal and Spain for years trying to get funding for this. And people thought he was, And then eventually he gets an audience and he convinces Isabella that he knows what he's doing and the world is round, and so there must be a way to get to China the other way. And they go, oh, that could be useful. That might be useful. It's worth spending money to just find out if that's the case. Better we find it out before anyone else finds it out. Also, they had basically just lost the whole of the west coast of Africa in this deal they did with Portugal. Bear in mind, Spain and Portugal are the superpowers here by the end of the 15th century, by the door of which we're opening now into the beginning of the 16th. They have basically sat down and divided up the world between them in hemispheres. They're talking in you take all of that, we'll take all of this. So Columbus set sail and, of course, inadvertently almost discovered the new world. And what else happened in 1492 in Spain? So maybe that's four things. The final end of Islamic presence with the eventual defeat and vanquishment of the last Islamic kingdom in Spain, which was, of course, Granada. And in exactly the moment at which Granada relinquished control to the United Crown of Spain is the moment at which the Alhambra decree came into force. And you can imagine that if the entire Jewish community of Spain, and people go, oh, the Jews of Spain, is that like the Jews of Caulfield? Is that like, the Jews of Muncie? Is that like the Jews of Manchester? What does that mean, the Jews of Spain? It means the largest and most dynamic Jewish community in the world that had been basically the most dynamic Jewish community in the world for the last 700 years. Suddenly, overnight, and as you can imagine, we threw everything we had at the Alhambra decree. And nothing helped. Don Yitzchak Abravanel, who I will talk about in a few moments, threw virtually all of the resources of the Jewish community of Spain in the quest of prolonging or delaying or averting the decree, and he managed to get an extension on the decree for 2 days. It was deferred from July 31 to August the 2nd, while they were going to think about the 4 gazillion ducats that he was going to offer to avert it. And suddenly, now the numbers are not simple. Historians are very, very complex discussions on what numbers we're talking about. Of course, here's Spain and here's Portugal. So, and what the choice was this. The only way you're not going to be expelled, of course, is if you convert to Christianity. If you become a converso, a new Christian, you stay. You keep your house, you keep the good school your kids are at, you keep your BMW, you keep your super, everything, all the perks you get, you just got to be Christian. But after 1492, it's going to be illegal to be a Jew, a practicing Jew in Spain. So most of the Jews that leave, and bearing in mind that there are different estimates on how many stayed, it could be up to 100,000 stayed, or it could be that 100,000 became new Christians in the preceding few decades, but generally the numbers are between 40 to 100,000 refugees from this Alhambra decree. Most of whom, the bulk of whom, I would say probably it's 3/4, simply went over the border to Portugal. Yep.
What was the population of Spain at the time?
Population, the total population of Spain? That's a very good question. As my father used to say, if a lecturer says that's a very good question, it means they don't know the answer. I'll make a note of that. I'm assuming, based on my knowledge of other kinds of population statistics I've seen around that field, that the population of Spain, I doubt that it was as much as 2 million. And I think that the Jewish population was edging 10%. It was a very significant population. That's just identifying themselves. In other words, you've probably got a lot more Jews genetically inside the population, as you do today. The statistics the genetic studies they've done on Spanish populations today are amazing. Just how many of them are wandering around with these converso genes in them. All right. And then, 4 years later, Portugal did the same thing. So people sometimes think, Spanish expulsion, 1492, we know they were kicked out of Portugal, okay, that's it. Of course, I'm not talking about the Inquisition so much right now, because I'm assuming that we understand that the Inquisition was one of the major pushes behind this whole thing, and it's really an end of 15th century phenomenon. We've got so much to talk about that I will come back to the Inquisition. But you realise that is the overarching theological push behind all this. But in Portugal was actually kind of okay with these Jews coming in. As you can imagine, you have like 40 to 50,000 Jews suddenly coming in, right? You've got a few social issues on your hand if that's the case, but your economy will do better. But in 1496, it turns out that Manuel, the King of Portugal, wants to make an alliance by marriage with the Spanish crown. And to do that, they say, yes, we're okay with that shidduch, but looking at your country, King Portugal, you've got Jews. Really? So Portugal decrees all Jews must go. With a difference. And the difference in Portugal, people don't realise, I just spent a minute on the difference between the Spanish and the Portuguese expulsions, because the Portuguese kicked out all their Jews but didn't let anyone go. First of all, you weren't allowed to leave with your children. I'll say that again. You weren't allowed to leave with your children. You were not allowed to leave with any assets. He had 20,000 Jewish men lined up in the middle of Lisbon in the heat of the day in a courtyard and didn't give them anything to eat or drink until they agreed that they and their families will convert to Christianity. They didn't, but he said, because now everyone's Christian, I'm going to give the Jews some time to adapt to this new reality. We're not going to interfere with them for 30 years. Unlike Spain, who Tucker really did kick all the Jews out and gave them freedom to go, but within a very short space of time, and said, you've got 3 months to get out of here, and after that, you can't be Jewish, but if you want to go, you go. But right the next day, on the day after the expulsion, we're going to start cranking up the heat of the Inquisition to find out who's Jewish and who's not. Follow what I'm saying? So the Portuguese had this technical thing where 30 years they weren't going to make too much questions of the Jewish community. So most Jews then are leaving Portugal. So that's kind of one thing that if we walk into the year 1500, we are reeling from those two events. And where did these tens of thousands of refugees go? Well, they went everywhere. We know, I mean, more or less correct, but we know that Some went north, not that many. This thing about how, the Portuguese went and they set up Jewish communities in Amsterdam, that's kind of later. They really weren't pouring into these countries here for another century, the bulk of Portuguese Jews. They were, in fact, heading to North Africa, but things in North Africa were not so cool for Jews. There was a particularly uniquely flavoured, Islamic flavoured anti-Semitism was going on over here. So many of them tried to get to Italy. And the problem with Italy is that in the Papal States, ironically, the closer you were to the Pope, the more stable Jewish life was. The Pope was not as interested as some of the European rulers on banning Jews or limiting them or whatever. There were restrictions, and most of the popes were horrible, but life was a kind of a little bit... because the Pope would have found it theologically awkward to have no Jews around. He's the Pope. He's got to have some Jews in a kind of a slightly oppressed state around, driven by different motives. But the problem with living in the Papal States is that if you wanted to live in Italy, you really needed geld. You really needed money. Communities were tough. If you turned up at a Jewish community in the 16th century, in a place like in Italy, in any of the Papal States or towns in Italy, and you didn't have business there, they would not let you in. They would lock you out. They would say, move on. Jews need to be accounted for. Taxes need to be paid. The government authorities need to know how many Jews... Jews were a thing. They weren't just people. This is the first stage of consciousness we have to have going back 500 years. Jews are not simply people who walk around, Carlisle Street or Chadstone and go, I'm a normal person, I happen to be Jewish. Jews were Jews. They were identifiable entity, and that was who they are. And we need to know how many Jews we have. You can't just stay here in this town. So most of the Jews, a few Jews went to Italy, the ones that managed, from Spain, the ones that managed, and Portugal, the ones that managed to have money, and ended up in places, Venice and Naples and Ferrara and all the different principality towns that there were. But the bulk of Jews, and also about a third of the refugees, didn't make it. It was tough. It was tough. Thousands died in the fleeing from Spain and Portugal. But the bulk of those who made it ended up going more or less to the Balkans and the westernmost edges of the Ottoman Empire, and from there either settled in the Ottoman Empire or tried to get their way to Poland and Lithuania, where taste gefilte fish for the first time. It's a long way to the lands of Eastern Ashkenaz, but that's what they had to do.
Is it true that the Sultan of Turkey sends ships to take the Jews?
The man is inside my mind reading the projector screen. That was going to be my next sentence. Bayezid, the Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor at the time, could not believe what the Spanish and the Portuguese were doing, how stupid they were, and in fact, it took half a century before Spain realised, oops, we just ripped out the guts of our own economy. We can no longer afford to be the power we thought we were going to be. And in fact, not only did he think it was nuts, but exactly what you said, the Ottoman Empire sent ships to pick up Jewish refugees and bring them to the Ottoman Empire. Can you imagine? This is an Islamic empire, showing how you deal with refugees. He sent ships and he brought them. He said, I will find them safe harbour in the Ottoman Empire. And tens of thousands therefore settled in this entire area. So that is important to know in the context of some of the things we're going to be speaking about. And of course, just to quickly flick back to Portugal, it wasn't the end really of the troubles for the Jews of Portugal, because many stayed and made this outward conversion to Christianity. You know, you go and you stick your head in the baptismal font and you say what you have to say, and then you run home and you put on tefillin and have your piece of gefilte fish. Well, probably not in Portugal though. Because, and I don't want to go into this too much because it's very distressing. Those of you who pick up this point and think that's interesting and want to research this, it's a very distressing episode in history. But in 1506, there was a horrendous massacre called the Massacre at Lisbon, where they went into effectively the Jewish quarter, which was now known as the New Christian Quarter, but was mostly filled with Jews who, if they were Christian, they'd only been Christian for a few years, and many of them weren't yet Christian really, and up to 2,000 people were killed by this mob, but in the most horrendous pogrom and massacre, and men, women, children just killed in this horrendous atrocity. So people shouldn't think that it was kind of smooth from there. It certainly wasn't. And of course, all of the Jews that were trying to get out of Portugal, and that just created havoc right throughout the Jewish world, and is a havoc we're going to see played out over the next few decades. Of the many, many, many Jews that were affected by the Inquisition, by the expulsions, 2 are ones that we would have to spend a minute on just to understand that we've covered those so we know who they are, because their lives are so fascinating, because they are impactful, and because they affect things that are going to unfold afterward. And one, of course, is Don Yitzhak Abrabanel, because he comes from the famous Abrabanel family. Isaac Abrabanel. And he actually grows up in Portugal, but he has actually emigrated to Spain. After mid-career, when it was under threat of his life, he went to Spain. There's a whole lot of other court intrigue circumstances he got caught up in. But in Spain, he rises and rises within the context of Ferdinand and Isabella's new economy to become effectively their Minister of Finance. This Jewish guy, at a time where Jewish life in Spain was becoming more and more restrictive, and Ferdinand and Isabella were drinking more and more of the Inquisition Kool-Aid, and were actually getting harder and harder, Don Yitzhak Abrabanel's status was rising and rising. At the Alhambra Decree, they effectively said to him, "You can stay. We need you." And he said, "I'm not going to stay when you're going to kick out all the other Jews. What am I going to stay?" And they said, "Why not?" He goes, "Well, who am I going to pray with?" So they said, "We'll give you a minyan, right? We'll give you kosher food. We'll give you whatever conditions you need. We just really, really need you to stay." By that time, he had built up not only the fortune of this new economy, but had all the contacts, had all the resources. He said, "No, I'm not staying," and he fled. And he doesn't go to Portugal. He and his family end up in Italy. He's in Naples, and then the problem is that Naples then got invaded and the Jews kicked out of Naples, so he ends up in Venice and so on. What is amazing about these guys, like Don Yitzhak Abrabanel, is that he was not just some incredibly big civic statesman that, on behalf of the Jewish people and a leader of the Jewish community, he was a huge scholar. So when he found himself in exile, he wrote an entire commentary on the Bible, adapting the history of the day in his commentary. Probably one of the first commentators on the Bible to do that in the Jewish tradition, and focus specifically on the meaning and concept of exile. There was no question in his mind, and this is a very, very important point, there's no question in Abravanel's mind that this has happened to the Jewish people because we are at the advent of redemption. The Messiah, we can hear his footsteps. And many of his writings deal with the concept of the Messiah and the concept that we can see in current historical events, the arrival of the Messiah. Those of you who get excited by that kind of literature on the fringes of the internet today should be aware that those discussions were also happening 500 years ago in the wake of very catastrophic and dramatic events. That's not to say the Messiah is not coming. The Messiah can come at any moment in Jewish belief, but they really, really thought he was coming then. And not just Don Yitzhak Abravanel, but just about everybody. The other figure I just need to touch on before we move on to the everybody is another major figure of the expulsion. There are hundreds of them that we could talk about historically important, but if we could just mention two, I have to talk about Don Yitzhak Abravanel, and we have to talk about... Oh, I'm getting some names. Go on. Not yet. Not yet. These are Jews she belongs kind of slightly later, but excellent. That's very true. But I'm not going to deal with her just yet. Sorry? Oh, Maimonides. So Maimonides is living in the 12th century. Yeah, that's okay. So 300-400 years now he's been Oliver Sholem. Who's heard of this person? Oh, green.
Oh, yeah.
Ah.
That's why we're here.
I know. It's why you're here and it's why I'm here. Right. Okay. I'm just going to take a minute to background this so you realize who we're talking about. Yeah? Columbus wants to sail from Portugal to Manhattan. It's not Manhattan yet. They don't even know about North America. He's lucky to get to Central America, South America. He wants to sail to West. How is he going to know where he is? They don't have GPS. You know that the ancient world... Look. Who's the big emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century? We're going to learn about him. We're going to talk about him. It's Charles V, right? What was Charles V's motto? And Charles V, by the way, he was technically Charles of Spain. He was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. He became the Holy Roman Emperor. What was his personal motto? His personal motto was plus ultra, which means further beyond. Why did, and that is still today the motto of Spain, by the way, plus ultra. Why plus ultra? Because the ancient world knew that at the end of the world, here, were the Pillars of Hercules. And on the Pillars of Hercules were written the word non plus ultra in Latin. No beyond here. No further beyond. There is no further beyond. This is the end of the world. There's no further beyond. So the Spanish, who saw themselves as the ones who moved further beyond, took out the non and then went, we are plus ultra. Don't underestimate just how much ganum the Spanish had about themselves. They really saw themselves as shaping this new world. When Columbus, however, is going into this unknown, how's he going to know where he is? How did sailors in the age of discovery in which we are suddenly finding out about the world, things we had no idea about. How do they know where they are?
Yeah, compass, no?
Yeah, compass is going to tell you north, south, east, west. It's going to tell you where you are. Stars. Astronomy had provided navigation, but the problem is that once everything is in relation to land, but once you're going to be away from land for months and you're going to be in the middle of nowhere in areas where you'll see stars you've never seen before. And that's okay, but you need to know what latitude you're on and so on. Right? The whole thing wasn't really solved until the 18th century, but the way they dealt with it then was they needed the development of a whole new technology of astronomical tables that would show them the relationship. If this is there and this is there and the sun is there, Manang, it must mean mathematically and trigonometrically that you must be kind of there. But they're not going to work all that out. They need these tables, hundreds of sheets of tables with mathematical calculations with the latest mathematics of the 16th century or the 15th century could provide. Who made that? When Columbus went to sail, whose charts did he use? When Vasco da Gama, Zacut, of course, expelled from Spain, goes to Portugal. And in Portugal, Vasco da Gama goes, we want a new route to India via Africa. How do we do that? Zakut's here. Vasco da Gama gets personal shiurim, him and his whole staff, from Avram Zacuta before he becomes Vasco da Gama. And of course, once the Portuguese expulsion happens, then Zacut leaves Portugal and, like so many of his compatriots, makes his way to the Ottoman Empire, and he actually ends up in Jerusalem. He says, I want to end my days in Jerusalem. In the course of his wanderings, Avram Zacut writes a famous book which we now know as Sefer HaYuchasin, which is the first real historical work of Judah. It's like the first attempt to write an uber history of the whole of the Jewish people in relation to world history. The very kind of approach we have here is pioneered by Avraham Zacut. Obviously, there's a crater on the moon named after him. And as there is Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, those two craters are right near each other. Massive, massive intellect. Jews are producing incredible people, and they are yet still getting expelled. All right, 1500.
How did you get this knowledge?
Very good, very good. Well, this entire lecture is not on Zacuto, and I wish it was, but in very, very great summary, he knew because Rabbi Levi ben Gershon, the Ralbag, in the 14th century, was already the first person to develop trigonometric tables to 5 decimal places. So Zacut became aware of that and then started applying those newfound mathematical charts to the problem of navigational astronomy. He was the first to do that, and he'd sit down and he did the work. It took him several years. He worked it all out, and it's like a kind of, you put in the work, you have the technology, and he had it. But it was actually emerged from his own studying his own Jewish learning. He was a very bright boy, and he did that as a young man, and then without even realizing just how important it would be, because in order to realize how important something is, you need conditions to provide the opportunity for that to happen. Once, of course, he was the one that advised Columbus, then, and this, by the way, all during a time where they did not know how big the world is. That was one of the big things about the New World. That would mean that the globe is like, not like this, it's like this. Many, many, many people in the early 1500s were expecting the redemption. And that kind of burst through, as it sometimes does. But it didn't burst through so much yet. Apart from the writings of Don Yitzhak Abrabanel, it didn't necessarily burst through much with the refugees from Spain and Portugal, because who were landing in new communities all over the place and creating this whole new Sephardic influx into what had traditionally been alternative and different types of communities. But in fact, it burst through in northern Italy and in Germany in a movement that decided to call for the year 1502, was known throughout the Jewish world. The year 1502 was known as the year of repentance. They decided to declare a year of repentance where everybody was going to try and up their game spiritually and be better people. A lot of praying, a lot of fasting, a lot of charity, a lot of very religious and devotional outpourings. The person who is critically leading up to that, the person who was driving that, was a very, very interesting figure called Asher Lemlein. Asher Lemlein is called by some historians as a kind of false messiah. He actually never said of himself, "I am the Messiah," but he was fully aware that he was leading this movement which really had waves right around the Jewish world, was very much focused on the center of the Jewish world, so everybody would have heard about it. And Lemlein was proposing and promoting this year of repentance. He's a confusing figure because historians seem to have a very vague idea of whether he was a very young man or very old man. The general consensus is that he was quite an aged man by the time he came on the scene of people's consciousness. It was taken very seriously. There are books from later in the 16th century where they write about how one famous rabbi that they actually record living here after Pesach of that year, he destroyed the oven used to bake the matzahs. That's a massively important piece of equipment, a communal matzah baking oven. He destroyed it in full belief that they would not need it next year. That next year they would be in Jerusalem, that the Messiah would come as soon as this year of Teshuvah, this year of repentance, was complete. The year of repentance came and went, and it would appear, to our limited knowledge, that the Messiah did not come. That had some repercussions, not as massive as 150 years later with the Sabbatean events and so on, but that had repercussions. I'm going to touch on those repercussions in a few minutes. Of course, still on backgrounding, several developments. The Ottoman Empire obviously you go from Bayezid II and then you go to Selim I. Selim I is this enormous expansionist emperor of the Ottoman Empire, ends up conquering all the major conquests that the Ottoman Empire are famous for, including, of course, in the year 1517. In the year 1517, they conquer Syria, Palestine, and then on to Egypt. And therefore, in 1517, they become the masters of Jerusalem. That means, cosmically, I'm not going to go into this too much. Some of you are aware of that I can be easily distracted by ooga booga cosmic ideas, but basically, the most powerful political empires in the world have always been the ones to control Jerusalem. But 1517 is a watershed year in Jewish history because that, of course, is exactly the same year as things really start getting cracking in the Holy Roman Empire, in an entirely different universe in the Christian world. Because in and of course, that's the year that the Ottoman Empire declared itself a caliphate. And in precisely that time is when this world cracked. It cracked. Well, the beginning of the crack is 1517, because the beginning of the crack is Luther. And Martin Luther, a young priest with some serious complaints about the church, posts those complaints on the church door in the town of Wittenberg and begins the Protestant Reformation. That's the beginning of Protestantism. That is the beginning of the whole really kind of conceptually and intellectually the watershed of the modern era being ushered in and the old going. Certainly because those theological changes in the world were massive. It completely flicked the forks at the authority of the Pope, regarded the Bible as the supreme revelatory authority of God. The Bible, the grace of God, could be understood through the Word of God as read by the individual. And that's a massive moment. And he didn't need popes and priests and so on coming and telling him all of these boobermeisters. It's in the Bible what he has to do, and he is guided to read the Bible by the Holy Spirit, and he doesn't need the Pope or any of the indulgences that the Catholic Church offers to interface between him and God. It's a very, very, very pure idea. If in fact you were really wanting to effect a reformation in Christianity, you would pretty much say what Luther said and you would do what Luther did. The problem is, of course, is that for us, and I'll get onto this maybe a little later, this for us, of course, is that Luther was let me quote, the biggest and the greatest anti-Semite of his age. Just before I deal with that, what I just said is a quote. Do you know who said that? The Nazis. With pride. Always remember that. At the Nuremberg rallies, they had manuscripts of Luther's works in glass boxes on display. His ideas about the Jews, his text, The Jews and Their Lies, was reprinted numerously throughout the Nazi period. They thought Luther had absolutely nailed it because, as you said, he started off by saying, well, the problem with the Jews is that they've never seen the light of Christ, because what do you want from them? They've only ever heard about Christianity from the Catholic Church, and the Pope is the Antichrist. But if they were to hear about Christianity and the truth of Christ from someone like me, they would suddenly realize, oh, no, that's a religion we can believe in, and they will convert and they'll all make fine, upstanding Christians.
It's just like Muhammad.
Very similar, except that it's like Muhammad on crack. Because Muhammad turned around and said, oh, those Jews, what are you going to do with them, right? The people of the book, until they realize the truth of Allah and the Quran, they're just going to have the status of dhimmi. They're going to have some deferred status there. But that's not Luther. When Luther found out the Jews weren't going to buy his theology, he said, burn them. He came just short of advocating murdering Jews, and in fact many of his followers thought that was precisely what he meant and went out and did it. Luther was an enormous anti-Semite whose reputation has never been recovered. I've seen the writings of Lutheran theologians who are really, really pissed off that Luther didn't die much earlier before he said those things that were just horrendous. Anyway. And of course, the other...
What about, you say about Luther 1517? But King Henry VIII, he was 1492, no?
No, King Henry VIII Henry VIII... No, it doesn't come to the throne till around 1509. Yeah. I'll deal with Henry in a moment, actually. Because all of the things I'm telling you is not in any particular order. I'm just roving around the very beginnings of the 16th century to give us a picture of what's happening geopolitically and culturally in that world. And I can't move into more detail without talking about one more thing that is humongous. On the one hand, in world history, we've just discovered a whole new world. The world has got a whole lot bigger. Also, economically, we're seeing the coalescence of major powers. We're now entering into this kind of superpower regime kind of thing that we're now familiar with. Even 500 years later on, we think in those terms. These are the terms that were coming into vogue in the 16th century. We've seen new trade routes open, which means that new goods were flooding into Europe, and if you controlled the shipping and you controlled the transportation and commercialization of those goods, then you were making lots of money. And of course that meant that after doing that for a while, the English and the French and the Dutch and others wanted to get in on that, which is really what's behind most of the wars, that and the theological issues, because the Reformation didn't come without a price, and there were wars throughout Europe for the next couple of hundred years on precisely that subject. Wars. It's all very well for us to sit around today and go, oh, the Muslims, the Shia and the Sunni, they're crapping the shit out of each other and they hate each other, what's stupid. They don't realise that in Europe, exactly the same thing was happening, 500 years ago, but that's exactly what was happening. Two different versions of Christianity were slugging it out in the most violent way imaginable. So, but there's one more thing we still need to talk about. Did someone go, really? No, because the background is important. Without this, it's difficult to understand. And you mentioned it earlier. A few people mentioned it earlier. You mentioned it earlier. And it is, of course, printing. And just as they will look back at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century and go, they didn't realize it then, but that's the internet. That was a pretty big moment in the transition of, human consciousness. Printing is enormous. Printing is the beginning of the information age. How long prior to printing do you think it took on average to produce one book? For one individual? About 6 months for your average book. If you had like a monastery, which is effectively a manuscript production house, like a factory, the estimates generally were that if you had 45 people working full-time at the creation of manuscripts, they could produce about 200 books over the course of about 2 years. Printing, ka-chung, 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 ka-chung. So by the year 1500, I'm not talking specifically titles, nor am I talking specifically, just world books. By the year Gutenberg's the middle, about 1455 is the Gutenberg Bible, yeah? By 1500, 6 million books had been produced. Amongst those, thousands, of course, were Jewish books. There were approximately 200 titles. I don't know how many titles of the 6 million, how the 6 million spread across titles in general books, but the Jewish world was right into printing from the start. And if you think about it, 20, 30 years after printing, to have 200 published books already, like of classic Jewish works, circulating right around, and of course printing, the first printing houses, Jewish printing houses, were being set up in Italy. And then of course then that went throughout the Holy Roman Empire in different places. The guys coming from the Gerush, they set up printing houses in Constantinople and so on. The first Jewish book published, of course, was a Chumash with Rashi. And the second was, of course, Sonsino's first book, which was Tractate Brachot of the Talmud, the first Talmudic tractate. And they also, all these early printers, they're the ones who were determining for future generations, for the centuries that come, exact layout of the Talmud and the Bible and how that's going to work. Not all Hebrew printers were Jewish. The famous house of Daniel Bomberg and so on, these were Christians. Why were Christians producing, Hebrew books? Why were Christians producing Hebrew books? In some places, not everywhere, but in some places.
Christians were also interested in the Old Testament.
They were interested in the Old Testament, and we're going to get onto that in a second. But why were Christians? Why would you look? Imagine someone. Huh? No. But the question: Jews could read, but the question is why? Jews could read, so Christians could print. Now, why? The question is why were Christians producing Gemaras and Chumashim and Sidurim? Why were they printing Jewish Hebrew texts? I haven't heard the answer yet, so I'm going to tell you. Because Jews weren't allowed to. In many places. Why were Jews not allowed to print? Because Jewish literature is a problem for Christians if you're in the 16th century. Not only is it the foundational literature of an entire spiritual way of life that you are trying to get these Jews away from, but is also very, very possible that some of the content that's being produced is not exactly positively disposed towards Christianity. And of because for money, commercial opportunities, they knew that plenty of Jews would buy the books, so they would liaise between the Jewish communities and the government authorities, which is really, in this case, the church authorities, which is why the 16th century sees the rise of this concept called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of prohibited books, which is growing and growing and growing. Oh, by the way, because I'll regret if I don't say this. When was the Alhambra decree of the expulsion of the Jews of Spain, when was that officially revoked? 1968. Just that thought, just realisation came to mind. So, but many Jews are printing books. I'm only talking in certain places. Christians were printing books. The Bomberg, famously, who brought out the first edition of the Talmud, was a Christian. But the church authorities were watching Jewish literature like hawks, because they themselves had this kind of awkward relationship with printing, but they knew the Jews would just love printing and production of books. And that has not changed. I mean, Israel today produces more books per capita than any other country of the world off the scale. And that was the case there. As soon as we got this technology, we thought, oh, brilliant, everyone's going to have their own siddur, they won't be fighting over machzorim, and there was this, and everybody can have their own copy of the Gemara, and we can do this, and everybody can have their own Haggadah around the table, and there won't be any fights, and it's a good bar mitzvah presents, and besides which, I want, when someone comes to visit, I want to show them my library, and I got books, books, I learn, and blah, blah. Books. So once printing starts becoming widespread, there becomes now an interest, as this gentleman alluded to before, Christians start taking an interest in Hebraic literature. Some of them with a view to antagonistic agendas, and some of them with a view towards actually thinking maybe there's some serious wisdom in here. After all, the people of Israel, Jesus was a Jew, there's ancient wisdom here that from thousands of years, this might actually be quite useful to know, and they started learning Hebrew and started getting involved in Hebrew writings and understanding things right from the Bible and biblical commentaries. Remember, we just come out of the Middle Ages, we've got lots of amazing biblical commentaries right up through to books dealing with Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. And non-Jews such as Pico della Mirandola and guys like Johannes Reuchlin were becoming very, very big experts in Jewish literature, and then the church would turn to people like that, Christian scholars of Jewish literature, to be guided by what books were allowed to be printed. So in the first couple of decades of the 16th century, there's this immense movement within the church, a huge polemic over whether or not we will allow the Jews to print the Talmud. We're trying to wean them off the Talmud. We're fairly convinced now that the Talmud is the reason the Jews have not become Christian. The Talmud is basically the foundation of their whole way of life and the whole way they view the Bible and the whole way they view the world. What we need to do is we need to ban the Talmud. And in many places, thousands of copies of the Talmud were burnt and destroyed at the beginning of the 16th century. But the popes now were interested in the idea of maybe banning the Talmud right throughout the whole of the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. That would have had a profound effect on Jewish intellectual life. Jewish life generally, Jewish spiritual culture. And so they set up a commission of important Christian scholars to look at this issue. Two of them, there were four, two of them, the most virulently anti-Talmudic and anti-Jewish members of that commission were former Jewish boys, converts to Christianity who had become completely verbrennt. Guys like Johannes Pfefferkorn and Victor von Karben. These guys were serious about wanting to banish the Talmud from the whole of the world. Some historians have surmised that Pfefferkorn and Karben were disillusioned Jews from the year of repentance. Apparently, the disillusionment from Asher Lemlein's project had certain repercussions around the place, one of which was, according to some historians, this onflow of anti-Judaism from converts to Christianity. In any event, 3 of the commission agreed to ban the Talmud. And I tell this story, it's so important because it exemplifies the tensions at the beginning of the 16th century. And they went to Johannes Reuchlin. Reuchlin at this stage is the greatest acknowledged Christian scholar of Jewish literature. And they said to him, "No, you're Reuchlin. We need your signature on this." And he said, "I will not put my signature to ban a book that I have not read." We think today that's common sense for most people. But in the 16th century, that is a magnificent expression of humanistic thought. The idea that, I understand you don't like the Talmud, you think that's what, but to be honest, the Talmud's pretty big. Most Jews haven't gone through it. I haven't gone through it. But I'm not going to ban a book based on you telling me what you think is in it. And as a result of which, the commission was wound down, and through Reuchlin's efforts, the Talmud was printed.
Why do they care so sensitive to the issue? I mean, sure, they were killing Jews. Why did you just ban it? What was the big deal?
Okay, I'm going to answer that. It's going to take 1 minute. I'm going to answer that. Because there are 2 ways of dealing with the Jews. You either oppress them, and that goes the whole range from expulsions through to killing, through to all sorts of economic disincentives, or you either oppress them into accepting Christianity, or you enlighten them into accepting Christianity. This is a tension that goes right throughout the Middle Ages. The whole foundation of the concept of the Middle Age dispute, the famous dispute between Jews and Christians that would act out on formal stages, that's part of the Enlightenment project. Oh, the Jews are just like us, they've just got the wrong religion. So, you come along and you go, okay, let's enlighten the Jews. So you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, the truth of Christianity is completely blindingly obvious to you. It's amazing. I've got these prophets in the Old Testament. I've got Yoshka over here. They all fit beautifully, right? Isaiah is talking about Jesus. Jesus is talking about Isaiah. Everything comes together. I don't understand why the Jews have a problem with this. The Jews have had the Bible. They're walking around with the Bible. They're reading it every day and they can't see it. The only reason they can't see it is because they are divinely blinded. But our job is to lift that veil and to show them the truth of Christ. So you come to a Jew and you go, oh, Jew, have a look here at what it says in this Bible. And the Jew goes, oh, okay. Can't you see that what that's talking about is the Messiah, Jesus? And the Jew goes, no, I can't see that. Why can't you see that? Because that's not how I understand that verse. Well, who told you how to understand that verse? Ah, the Talmud. And after you do that for a few hundred years, then the Christians go, maybe we should get rid of the Talmud. But it's a very, very interesting, I've just given a summary of it, but it's a very interesting discussion. Reuchlin is huge, but he is part of a genre of people. So you've got these competing interests, people who are wanting to shun the Jews, people are wanting to accept them. And then of course, we've got this new concept that's going to come up. I'm just laying foundational concepts here for what we're going to talk about in the next 3 weeks. So we're going to get into detail in the next 3 weeks, but right now I've just got to deal with fundamental things. Otherwise you'll walk out and you'll go, oh, yeah, he gave us the history roughly up until around 1550. I'm only dealing with kind of the first half today, but he didn't talk about this, this, and this. So I'm going to talk about this, this, and this now. And of course, as you know, let's go back to Italy, because Italy is so interesting. First of all, if you want to be anywhere in this period, like if you've got the time machine, we're going to go back and we're going to say, where are we going to start? You want to start in Italy because you're in the middle of the High Renaissance. Yep, and there's some seriously cool art going on. 1503, right at the beginning of the 16th century, is when Michelangelo starts chipping away at his statue of David and so on. And, you know, you've got Michelangelo's about to paint the whatever, right? Sistine Chapel and other things. It's all happened. He's already done that, I think. Leonardo da Vinci is about to paint the Mona Lisa, really, if you're looking at me like,
Weren't there a lot of Jews in Florence? They had quite a bit of influence into Christians.
yeah, but it's a very similar pattern. And that's why I'm going to touch on that just now. A lot of what's going on in Italy is really, really getting determined from Rome by the Pope. Because ultimately, if you're in Italy, you're in the Papal States. And in the Papal States, the Pope is both the spiritual and the temporal ruler. And let me tell you something. I've got to tell you something. This might not be known by you, most of you, right? That in relation to Jews, I don't want to offend anybody, you see, but in relation to Jews, until very, very recently, most popes are awful. They are awful. They're awful. They're just awful. But bizarrely, I'm talking in relation to Jews, right? They might be great patrons of art. They might be great theological thinkers in their own field. They might whatever. But in relation to Jews, they are all awful. But except in the early few decades of the 16th century, we just so happened to get just before I tell you this. This is not an ADD moment, relax. Just before I tell you this, because I'll tie it in and I'll show you. You know, I spoke earlier about Charles V, his personal motto was plus ultra, right? Do you know who else's motto is plus ultra? Donald Trump. And he has it written, inscribed on the walls of Mar-a-Lago, plus ultra, right? And the reason I'm suddenly realising that is because there's a connection between that and what I'm about to say. Because in the early decades of the 16th century, we didn't have them. There were two popes that were basically known as the Jew-friendly popes. Leo X and Clement VII, from a Jewish perspective, were cool. And why were they cool? I mean, I'm not talking about in what ways were they good to the Jews, but what's the probable reason they were cool and didn't have a problem with Jews is because they were both Medici popes. So they came from the whole of the Medici background, which basically bought the papacy in the early 16th century through massive corruption. And of course, the Medicis, having come from, running a bank for a couple of centuries and just, being one of these wealthy kind of Venetian families, they were used to Jews. They knew Jews. They dealt with Jews all the time. They were that was part of their world. They didn't have a problem with Jews. Clement VII was so friendly to the Jews that on several occasions he actually saved, basically the Jewish people from a number of different catastrophes and made several pronouncements that were very, very favourable towards Jewish people generally within the Papal States, and even had a benign attitude that spilt over into Charles V, because even though Charles V himself was not exactly the sort of guy you'd give an aliyah in shul to, even he had Jews burnt and all the rest of it, because he was at the end of the day a Christian emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But he basically gave an undertaking that there would be no undue anti-Semitism or expulsions or oppressions of Jews throughout the Holy Roman Empire, under certain conditions. It's not exactly as benign, but there was kind of like a benign onflow from here. So that's one thing that we need to background. But yet, before these guys came to the papal throne, there were some developments that had started happening in Italy under the previous awful popes. When they talk about Julius II as being this amazing patron of the arts, you've all heard of Pope Julius and how he commissioned Michelangelo. He was awful to the Jews. And so there's this new idea comes into the world at the beginning of the 1500s, and it starts in Italy. And I've said this before, so you're all familiar with this. It's this idea. The Jews. What are we going to do with them? Let's take all the Jews of a place and put them into a small concentrated area and put a wall around it and give them a curfew. And we're going to do that so that if we need the Jews for anything, we know where to find them. That, of course, is the ghetto. The word ghetto originally means foundry, because it was in fact at the new area of Venice set aside for a foundry, and that's why it's originally called the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto. And the word ghetto then spread from Venice to become anywhere where Jews were forced to live within a particular city, and then from there in the 20th century it's already becoming applied to areas for black people and for other minorities and so on, to be called a ghetto. But the word starts in Italy with the Jewish community of Venice being concentrated into this area. Of course, sorry?
Which pope is that?
Julius. I'm fairly certain it was Julius. If it wasn't Julius, it was Leo. But I don't think, it doesn't sound like Leo. Are you looking that up as we speak?
No.
It's just you're playing with your... So I was going to say, if you want to look it up, but I'm fairly sure that it was Julius. So I'm going to tell... we've got 5 minutes. 5 minutes. I wanted to talk now about the Rovani events. Some of you have heard me speak about that before, obviously. Put up your hand if you know what I'm talking about, the Rovani and Molcho events. Come on, put up your hand, please. Yes. I was going to talk about it, but like there's only two people here, but I'll talk about it a bit differently, all right? Because I know you... It is the most fascinating thing, and so maybe we'll end on that, because I've just about covered enough background material so that this story can now make sense. Because in 1522, in 1523, okay, I'm going to have to reduce this to 2 minutes. In 1522, 1523, a man turns up at the Venice ghetto, and he's only about 4.5 feet tall, and he's got like dark brown skin, and he's wearing these bizarre oriental clothes, and he's carrying a big flag, and he gathers the leaders of the Venice ghetto together. And you know, by this time already, the Venice ghetto itself, even though it's a ghetto, it's got 5 different shuls going already, because you've got so many different things. You've got an Ashkenazic shul and a Spanish school and a fifth school and an Italian shul. You know, have you been to the Venice ghetto, right? So you've seen that. And pretty much how the Venice ghetto is now is how it was then. It probably looks pretty similar. Might have smelt a bit differently, but it looks pretty similar. So he turns up and he gathers the leaders together and he goes, I would like you to get me an audience with the Pope. And they go, really? And who are you? And he said, my name is David Rovani, David the Reubenite, and I have travelled for months and months and months to get here. I come from way over here on the other side of the mystical river Sambatyon that can only be crossed on Shabbat, because during the week all these boulders bob up and down. You can't cross it, but on Shabbat the boulders come to rest so you can hop over them. On the other side of the mystical river Sambatyon are living the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And my brother is the king and I'm the minister of war. And I've come all this way because the time of redemption is at hand. I need an audience with the Pope. They're very impressed. Don't forget that people have just discovered a whole new world. So, in fact, a book published by Avraham Farisol, who was the first serious Jewish geographer, the first Jewish book to talk about the New World, he has a whole chapter on investigating David Rovani's claims of where he came from. Even since the advent of GPS, we have not yet seen the mystical river Sambatyon, but it doesn't mean it didn't exist. He came from here. 6 weeks later, he's going into Rome and into the Vatican on top of a big white horse. And he has an audience with Clement. And Clement's very impressed and very taken. He's a very charismatic guy, Rovani. And he gives him letters of introduction so that Rovani can go on this big tour all around the Jewish world. And in the middle of the 1520s, he ends up in Portugal, where he's warned not to Judaize, although he's not technically seen as a Jew. He's a member of the house of Israel because he's from the tribe of Reuben, but nevertheless, not from the tribe of Judah, but that's okay. He's warned. And he's in Lisbon having conversations with John, King John III of Portugal, Manuel's son, who, by the way, is a tragically, psychologically afflicted individual because his father married his fiancée. And if your dad does that to you, it kind of stuffs you up mentally. Anyway, he's chatting with him, and while he's in Lisbon, a young converso courtier called Diego Pires is very taken by Rovani and starts to want to explore his own heritage. He now realizes he's a converso from Judaism. He looks into his own roots. He studies Judaism. He thinks, he studies, he thinks. He goes talk to Rovani, comes back, and all the time, finally, he decides he goes to Rovani one night and he says to him, circumcise me. And Rovani says, no thank you. 2 reasons. 1, no thank you. And 2, if I do that, do you realize how much trouble we will both be in? So Diego goes home and he circumcises himself. Don't try that. And he changes his name to Shlomo Molcho. Molcho and Rouveni then get out of Portugal El Pronto, and they go on this big mystical tour, and by around about the late 1529, 1530, and by the way, they're going to communities all over the Jewish world. Yosef Karo, who I really needed to talk about, we've already reached the end, we've already reached 9:30. Yosef Karo, who was a small child, had come out of the Spanish expulsion, is living in Adrianople. And he remembers seeing Molcho and Rouveni and the incredible movement, the incredible things that they were saying. We still have Rouveni's diaries, we have Molcho's writings, we have their flag, we have the whole thing, as though this is fully based historical stories. So, and eventually Molcho decides that he has to go and see Clement the Seventh, the Pope. And he goes to Clement. Now that is a whole story in itself between Molcho and Clement. Really likes Molcho, saves his life a few times. There are whispers that Clement may have converted to Judaism. By this time, Molcho is having accelerated spiritual experiences. He prophesies a flood, he prophesies an earthquake, he's writing mystical discourses on Judaism. Like, we're talking, he is the deal. And he says to Clement, here's our plan. We're going to take all the united armies of Christian Europe, and we're going to join them with the armies of the lost 10 tribes living on the other side of the mystical river Sambachon that can only be crossed on Shabbat. And we're going to join them together, and we're going to have one last crusade. And we're going to kick the Muslims out of the Holy Land, and we are going to create an independent Jewish state backed by Western Christianity. Because you know, Clement, that you need to have an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel, backed by Western Christianity, before the Messiah can come. And Clement goes, I'm in. But I'm only the Pope. I don't call the shots around here. You have to go and get the support of the kings of Europe. I'll give you letters. So they go back to Portugal. John says, well, if Clement's in, then I'm in. But you would need to go and speak to the person who really calls the shots, which is Charles V. Charles is living in Regensburg. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, Charles V, grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, who kicked the Jews out of Spain. Charles V, who presided over the Diet at Worms that excommunicated Luther. Charles V, whose uncle, Henry VIII, has just taken an entire country, England, out of the church. And so these two guys come before him, and he takes Molcho and he burns him in Mantua in 1532. And Rouveni is sent back to Spain in chains. Molcho was burnt because he was a heretic, and Rouveni was taken, spent the rest of his life in a prison. On the day of the auto da fe of Molcho, Charles personally came down to the pyre that he was strapped to and said, if you convert now, I will tell them not to light. Renounce your heresy now and admit the truth of Christianity, I will tell them not to light the fire and you'll be free to go. And Molcho screamed the Shema in his face. And then people who saw that martyrdom were very shaky, even reports of that martyrdom, because Molcho and Rouveni's redemptive agitation and this idea that we can create an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel is the spark of the spark of the spark of the granddaddy of Zionism. Charles V himself, only going on for 3 or 4 minutes, okay, 2 or 3 minutes. Charles V himself had an amazing person that I'll have to speak about in detail another time because we don't have time. Yossel of Rosheim, or known as Yossel Rosheim, who is the archetypical and classic Stadlan, the one who would represent Jewish communities to the monarch and to the ruling authorities, who intervened again and again and again and again on behalf of Jewish communities, who had to defend Jewish communities in disputations not only about the truth of Christianity, but by 1530, the Jews of Europe, the Jews of Germany, were being blamed for the Protestant Reformation. And we laugh, but they were effecting pogroms based on this. Rosheim defended Jews and was very influential. And I'm full of Rosheim because he warned Molcho not to go to Charles V with this idea. This idea was an amazing idea, but the timing was not Right. The person I mentioned earlier, I'm finishing on this person. The person I mentioned earlier is Rav Yosef Karo. Yosef Karo, and I'm going to tell you something very, very interesting in a moment that not many people know. Yosef Karo was 4 years old at the Alhambra decree. The family went to Portugal, and then the expulsion from Portugal, they made their way to the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople and so on, but he basically grew up in the Balkans, grew up in Adrianople and in Bulgaria and places like that. And he grew up and he had a tremendous thirst to be a scholar. He had good teachers, his father was a scholar, and it was obvious. I mean, there was a bit of an economic divide between Jews that were going here and Jews that were going here, as I mentioned earlier, but amongst the Jews that were going to the Ottoman Empire, there were some seriously learned families, and by the time he was already in his early 20s, Karo was a significant scholar, and he then spent the next 20 years of his life doing the following. And I'm going to just explain this for 5 seconds, but I'm hoping that you can understand. Those of you who've sat with me in other Jewish history classes will know that throughout the Middle Ages, because Jews were so diversely spread in different parts of the world, they were developing codes of Jewish law. Yep. Maimonides is one example of that, but there were others. So what Yosef Karo did is he took all the major halachic codifications of the Middle Ages, the Rosh, the Rif, the Rambam, and so on, and he welded them together in one massive halachic synthesis that became the last universally recognized statement of Jewish law. It is still to this day the last fully recognized, universally recognized by everybody, statement of Jewish law, and that is called by us today Shulchan Aruch. It wasn't yet called Shulchan Aruch by Karo. He called it the Beit Yosef because it started as a commentary on a previous codification called the Torah. These are technical details, don't worry. What's important to remember is that Yosef Karo is this huge figure that sits on a cusp of Jewish history. On a cusp. The cusp between the period of the Rishonim and the period of the Acharonim. What is amazing, and I only realized this recently, and you can't tell anybody this. This is a reward for you coming tonight. You can't tell people this, because they'll lock me up and give me medication. But the reality is that it would appear, I've been talking for a long time because I base my whole teaching in a way of the structure of Jewish history on these 500-year phases, because I didn't make them up. They emerge from Jewish history. But on the cusp of each 500-year stage, it would appear that there is a supernova visible from Earth. There was a supernova visible in the 16th century, observed by Tycho Brahe and by Kepler and others, and there was a supernova in the 11th century, which Chinese and Islamic astronomers saw. We seem to have supernovae. Now, there are supernovas that happen in the galaxy and in other galaxies, but it's very rare to have a supernova visible from Earth. And it seems to happen every 500 years, and for some reason the sync happens to be with these big shifts in Jewish history. Now you can see why they would lock me up. But I'm just pointing it out. We do not know what we do not know. And that's kind of the magic of the 16th century, is that they were just discovering just how much they didn't know. And seeing a supernova in the 16th century was one of the very big moments that blew people's mind, because they realized that Aristotle was wrong. Because Aristotle had said that the celestial spheres do not change. And then they're going, there's a whole new kind of star arrangement going on up there that lasted for a couple of years. What was that? And that's like one of the big kind of motivations in science and so on, the magic of discovering what we do not know. And finally, we're going to have to talk at some point next time about the fact that in the 16th century, we start seeing the rise of the Jewish communities of Poland and Lithuania. And seriously, Rabbi Yaakov Polak was appointed in 1503 as the first chief rabbi of Poland. And Poland, in Krakow and in Lublin and in places under the Kingdom of Poland, became kind of almost the new center of the Jewish world as thousands of refugees started pouring in from various directions because things were getting very, very unpleasant again in the West. So I know that I've spoken tonight on background issues and we've just uncovered things generally. Thank you for listening to all of that. You've been very patient. There are some notes. So I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but I make an estimate and I wrote it up on a page. These are the things we'll probably talk about. And so don't expect too much from the notes, but they should be more or less an indication of the things that we spoke about, just to remind you so that you can do further research. In fact, give me a look at that, just make sure we covered most of it. I think, yep. Yes, most of that. But I'm hoping that now, so next week, it's going to start getting interesting, because now that we've backgrounded, we're going to go into some fair detail on what's going to happen next around the turn of the century and the big mystical revolution that is going to happen, and in a way a kind of Jewish reformation that is going to take place in the middle of the 16th century. But thank you for listening to that.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about David Solomon's books, recordings and classes, or to support his work and teachings for just a few dollars a month, visit davidsolomon.online.